you to introduce him.
Okay, does everybody know Dave? Dave McChesney, our intrepid officer. Uh-oh, now he's running away now. He's going to talk about, I believe, about characterizations and maybe some other stuff too. I didn't get a final on that. Is that right? Names of your characters. How to name your characters. Okay. Here you go, Dave.
All right, Joel, I want you to listen very carefully because he's going to teach you how to name your characters.
That can't be bad. It can only help.
Okay, can you hear me?
No. It's a directional mic. You got to talk right to it, I think. It appears to be
Okay, how's that?
better.
Okay,
I can hear you, but I'm not hard of hearing, so
okay,
that's better.
we'll see what we can do here. So, thank you, Carl, thank you, Sue. Thank you all for letting me be here and be your speaker again today. I've been a part of this group for going on 20 years now, maybe a little more, a little less. And over those 2 decades, I've had the chance to speak on occasion. And generally, my presentations have been independent, standalone type events, if you want to call it an event. I haven't been connected with any of my other presentations or with anybody else's presentation. A year or so ago, I concluded that my presentations, as infrequent as they are, should connect and build on one another. I decided to construct a series of talks taking us from the point where we realize, hey, maybe I'm a writer, and take us through the craft, the art, the process of writing, explore editing and refining our written work, investigate opportunities for publishing, and maybe even look at marketing. I don't know how many presentations it would take to get through all that. Since I only speak on occasion, I don't know how long it would take until we reach the end. Might be sometime into the 22nd century, who knows? And I don't claim to be an expert on anything, but as the saying goes, I've been there, I've done that. Maybe you'll learn something. But we should always remember that what works for me may not work for you. What works for you may not work for me. So back in January, when I did my first presentation, I talked a little bit about the uniqueness of each writer. I talked about choices, decisions we make as writers, even when we don't realize we're making a decision. And I shared a little of how the writing process works for me. So a year later, I've got a chance to come back and continue. And I realized I could take several different paths now to go through the art and craft of writing. And I had a couple ideas in mind, and I talked to Sue, or communicated with Sue, and she suggested that I should talk about names. Primarily, we're going to talk about character names, but we might explore some other areas where names are involved, if time allows. And I did go through this after I had it typed up, and we should have plenty of time. Usually when we talk about characters, we're referring to people, human beings, but characters can be more. They can be animals, animated beings, artificial life forms, alien life forms, mechanical or electronic entities, and so on. But for the most part today, we're going to focus on people, or perhaps near human-like entities as characters. The most important thing you can do for a character and for your reader is to give that character a name. Having a name secures that character's place within the story, and seeing that name on the page or screen lets the reader visualize that character as a unique individual. Even if all that's available is the character's name, the reader will distinguish that character from any others. The reader might also create a little mental file in their brain, a little spot to put information about that character, and as more information becomes available, they add it to that file. Now, if our story is at least semi-realistic, we want names that are real, that fit the time and place of the story. A name should fit the character's nationality, ethnicity, perhaps any religious affiliation, gender, and even generation. And here I'm talking about first names for the most part. I think most of us remember that when we were younger, when we were kids, there were certain names that were popular, that everybody had those names. You go into a classroom, you'd always have kids with classmates with these names. And there were other names that weren't very popular, that were rare, that you didn't hear of. But nowadays, those are the names that everybody seems to be giving their kids. A lot of differences in the type of names that we have available, that we see people using. So that's something to maybe consider when you write a story. So decades ago, back when I was in high school, I had this story floating around in my head that would eventually become the Stone Island Sea Stories. I knew the main character would be a Royal Navy lieutenant, but it wasn't until I sat down to actually try and write this story that I realized I needed a name for him. Even then, I saw that what I was writing might be what you would consider to be historical fiction. So I wanted a name that would fit him and the time of the story. I went to a very obvious source, a list of the presidents of the United States. That's because most of these individuals were of English or perhaps British descent. Not all of them, but most of them. So I went through the list, and the name Pierce caught my eye. It's relatively short, easy to pronounce and spell, and it does not scream president as soon as it appears on the page. And there's some on the list that might do that. And when first seen, a reader might wonder, is there some relationship or family ties between that character and that particular holder of the highest office in the land? So, the character's name is Pierce. And I tend to talk about characters, primarily adult male characters, by last name. And I suppose I was influenced to write in large part by C.S. Forester and his Horatio Hornblower stories. Forester generally talked about Hornblower rather than Horatio. I also served 22 years in the Navy, and for those who have served, you know the armed forces operate on a last name basis, and that might be an influence as well. But I believe characters, primarily main and major secondary characters, should have a first name. What if we write a scene where one or more of these people are in private, friendly, or relaxed conversation and address each other by first name? And we record such conversations as dialogue. You need a first name for the character. So to come up with a first name for Lieutenant Pierce, I went to another obvious source, the kings and other males in the royal houses of England and Great Britain. I chose the name Edward as his first name. Now, the name Edward and others on that list are names of kings and princes of the realm. They are also, for the most part, commonplace names that we're all familiar with. We likely know or have known individuals with those very names, and some of us may bear one or more of those names ourselves. And I made kind of a quick, off the top of my head list of names off that list, which would be Andrew, me, Charles, Edward, George, Henry, James, John, Philip, Richard, Robert, William, and probably more. We've all known people with those names, like I say, some of us in here probably have those names. So as I worked on this story, both back when I was a teenager and more recently, I follow the same basic process for naming characters. Sometimes a name popped into my head, and at other times a lot of thought went into naming a character. I used the list of presidents, list of kings, signers of the Declaration of Independence, signers of the U.S. Constitution, and other historical figures. Sometimes historical figures become characters in the story and are mentioned, or they're mentioned but don't appear. At other times, their names simply suggested a name for various characters within the story. I've also based character names on celebrities, authors, even names of other authors' characters, which I do very, very seldom. And if I thought a name was too obvious, I'd modify it slightly. So instead of Forrester, for C.S. Forrester, I have a character in there named Forrest. I was a Beatles fan ever since I was about the time I started to write this. And so instead of having a McCartney, I have a Cartney. Little things like that to come up with names that still sound, I think, fairly reasonable, fairly realistic. But I've also based character names on family, friends, co-workers, shipmates from my Navy days. Sometimes the appropriate name just popped up, and on occasion I invented a name or two. And the name's source isn't always what you would imagine. Within the story, we have an individual who starts out as the cook's helper, the cook's mate. And later he's a ship's cook, and his name's Franklin. But he isn't named for Benjamin Franklin, or Franklin Pierce, or the Franklin automobile, or anything like that. Years ago, a coworker told me that her maiden name was Franklin. So I filed the information away, and when I needed a character name, I used it. Now, depending on what we write, we might decide to make up or invent names for our characters. I did so in 2 short stories about the unseen visitors that appear in our 2 anthologies. I once saw where a schoolboy had signed his name, Noah, wrote in cursive, but he added a little hook to the H at the end of it. So I came up with the name for a character of Noak, N-O-A-K. And other names in the story are based on the characters' occupations or positions. Cap, who's the captain, Noam, who's number 1, Sakov, the science officer. We have a character named Redshirt, and Makitgo, who's the engineer. And yeah, there's a little bit of Star Trek lore into these stories and the names. And if you've had a chance to read the first story in our first anthology, there's a human character in there named Andy, and he's the night janitor at a particular installation. Well, that's me. And that part of the story is true. Now, some of the Stone Island Sea stories take place in a different but very similar world. Places there are equivalent to locations and places here. The first one we come across is a place called the Independent Lands of Vespica, and they're the equivalent of the United States of America. They're called the Independent Lands because that's what their founding fathers decided they were. Vespica, because the newly discovered world was also named for Amerigo Vespucci. But there they used his last name instead of his first, and over time it morphed from Vespucci to Vespica. Like America, Vespica was inhabited when it was, quote, discovered. The first original peoples we meet are the Kalish, a name derived from and hopefully in honor of the Salish of this region. The first Kalish individual we meet is their dream chief, Shostalamy. I wanted something that sounded like Snoqualmie, Skykomish, and other names of that sort, Snohomish, etc. Other Kalish individuals we meet within the story include the mother-daughter duo of Bessie and Cecilia. And they're named for a Native American mother and daughter duo, Bessie and Celia, whom I remember from my early childhood days in Alaska. I remember Celia babysitting my sister and I a couple of times. We also meet or are made aware of an individual known as Night Fisher, an individual known simply as Fred, and one known as Two Dogs. And that final name is probably not politically correct, and it's based on an old joke that I can't repeat here. And again, I don't mean it to be offensive to anybody. If somebody takes offense at it, I'm sorry, but that's just the way my mind works in coming up with some of these names. Okay. Elsewhere in that world, Europe is known as Baltica, basically the Baltic Sea with an A on it. Great Britain is Grand Triton, France is Galatia, Spain, Cordoba, and so on. The Mediterranean Sea is simply the Great Sea, or the Central Sea, excuse me. Can't read my own typing. And at that time, the Mediterranean was home to the barbaric pirates who preyed on merchant shipping of many nations, including the U.S. Early in the 19th century, around the time the Stone Island Sea stories are set, the U.S. sent a naval expedition to deal with the pirates. As a part of that operation, the United States Marines fought an engagement at a place called Derna along the coast of Tripoli. That action is commemorated in the Marine hymn with the line, "To the shores of Tripoli." Now, likewise, the Central Sea was home to a powerful and ruthless group of pirates. I recalled that on a particular map I had, Derna was not spelled D-E-R-N-A. It was spelled D-A-R-N-A-H. So I added the letters, or the syllable, S-I-A-N, to come up with Darnassian Pirates, which is the title of Book 3. That's how that title came about and how the pirates come up. Okay. So to name various city-states that the Darnassian pirates operate from, I just decided to create them out of the blue. And I found that crossword puzzles and word find puzzles can be of great help in doing that. Now, we expect answers in a crossword puzzle to be real words, but often they are multi-word phrases. When they're written together without spaces between the words, they can appear to be a different word. As a quick example, consider the two-word phrase, "I'm on." Like, right now, I'm on stage, you might say. And normally when we write that out, we have an apostrophe and a space between the two words. But in the puzzle, we would have printed I-M-O-N, probably all in caps. And that might appear as a word we could use as a name. We can also modify it, add letters, change letters, and so on to come up with what we want. How many of you are familiar with what we call word find or crisscross puzzles? It's ones with a grid of letters, seemingly at random, and a list of words to find or clues as to what words you're supposed to find. And the words can be horizontal, vertical, on either diagonal, and they can go in either direction. And when you solve these, when you're going through looking for words, it's common to discover real words that are not a part of that solution. And it's also possible to find letter combinations that are almost pronounceable, but not actual words. And we can use these letter combinations as a basis or modify them to make words more pronounceable, more realistic. And so towards the end of Book 3, we've come across a lot of names that I made up in that way. El Pasavito, Mendoceth, Mapakula, Atolathon, Katamugan, and there's also a place there in that world known as Masig, M-A-S-I-G. And that's a name arrived at by modifying an actual word. sigma, the Greek letter sigma. I simply swapped the two syllables N for N. And in creating words and names this way, I tried to make the word or name as pronounceable as possible, and not just a collection of letters. Because someday somebody might have to get up and actually read and pronounce those names in front of somebody. And we're getting almost to the end. I'm on page 6, and we got page 7, and I'm almost done. No cheers? Okay, I've always been one of these people that consider myself an organic or seat of the pants writer, which means I don't make an outline, I don't take a lot of notes. But as I was working on the second book, getting into that, and realizing that I actually have a fairly large cast of characters, I decided it was beneficial to create a list of characters. And doing so helps me in 3 different ways. Probably more, but that's the ones I could come up with. And the pages are sticking. Okay, first off, fewer random duplicated names. And yeah, I have a couple characters in there with the same name, but that was by design. The total reasoning behind that may not have played out, but they also have different first names. We have a Captain Lowell Jackson, and we have a Captain Granville Jackson. And there was something I was trying to do to contrast these two, but I wanted them to have the same name. But I also have 2 rather minor characters, known by last name only, who ended up with the same name. So if you run across a character named Dobbs, D-O-B-B-S, there's 2 different Dobbs in the story. But by the time I realized that books had already been published, so I just kind of left it alone. Figured if it confuses you, so what? Okay, 2, spelling consistency. I originally spelled a particular character's name N-E-W-B-U-R-Y, Newberry. But when he came back into the story after a long absence, I wasn't sure of how I'd spell it several months or years ago. I had to go back and look it up. I had to go back and find it to see which way I spelled it, because you could spell the Berry part B-E-R-Y, B-E-R-R-Y, B-A-R, B-A-R-R. You could do a whole bunch with that. I didn't want somebody to reading the stories who had remembered how I spelled it, of course, oh, this must be a different character. So that's why I wanted to make sure the names are spelled the same all the time. And lastly, the list helps me track characters' movements from places to place, ship to ship, as the story progresses. At one point, there are 2 characters named Davis and Campbell. They're the bosun's mates on the ship that we're on. Well, as we get further into the story, there's more ships involved. They've been warranted as bosuns. One's on one ship, the other's on the other ship. And I wanted to keep track of which character was on which ship, so I didn't confuse myself and didn't confuse the reader. Well, how come Campbell's on this ship now and on this, and now he's on this ship, and Davis is over here, but he's supposed to be over here? So that's why I've created a list. And just in case anybody wants to see it, send me an email and I'll send you a copy of it. It's about 6-7 pages, and I think it might be informative. You can also find it on my website, StoneIslandSeaStories.com. You have to kind of search for it a little bit. I forget exactly where it's at on there now, but it's in there. I think it's on, I think I got a section called research, and I think it's in there. And we're out of stuff. Any questions?
Well, it's not actually a question, but it's I've done similar things with my stories, and sometimes I'll have like a dozen or 2 dozen characters, and I wanna find something quick to come up with names of all of them. So I go to, letter tiles, like from Scrabble.
Yeah.
I roll dice to see how many letters, I pull that many tiles out, and, you know, work something out that's sort of a name.
Yeah.
Or I go through like, an encyclopedia, and random page numbers, and, oh, this could be a name, you know, whether it's a person or a place.
I think there's a couple characters in my stories where I actually opened up a phone book at random.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's an option, yeah.
I've done that.
I've done that.
Where do you get a phone book these days?
Yeah. I still got one from 2018 laying around the house, and every once in a while I use it to look something up just to see what it was or to track something down. There. Carl?
Yeah, when you use family members' names, do you ever kill them off in the story?
No. So that's one of the things that I've tried to do, is if I name a character after, I try to take, if I'm gonna give them a full first and last name, I try to take one person's first name, somebody else's last name, somebody else's personality, somebody else's appearance. And there's 2 or 3 times where I think I pretty much matched the characters' names with the characters, and that would be Bessie and Cecilia, who was a pretty close match to who they actually were. And there's mention in the 3rd book, we never meet him, there's mention of a James Montgomery. And Jim Montgomery was my uncle. And I'd come up with the name Montgomery from some other, and I finally decided I'd just give him the first name James. So that's, and I also mentioned a little bit about other authors' characters. Well, there's one part in the story where I wanted somebody to holler at somebody to hurry up with the coffee. And I didn't want them to say, hey you, or you there, hurry up with the coffee. I wanted a name. And the name I chose was Grayson, Grayson. Well, and there is a Grayson Pierce who is the main character in a series of stories written by an author named James Rollins. And there's Rollins in the story too, so that's where I borrowed the author's names. But it's not the character, it's simply the name. And we had a chance to talk over at PNWA one time, and we were wondering if Edward Pierce in my stories and Grayson Pierce in his stories might be distantly related. And I've also, quite by accident, discovered that the heroine in the story, Evangeline Smythe, that there is a name in a book that's out and around with that same name in it, character with that same name in it, and it's purely by chance. I've never read that other book. It's the one, something about some kind of something or other in the Potato Peel Society or something. One of those literary, probably get bored reading it, first 3 pages and put it aside and never read it, so. So, did I have any other comments or questions, or?
Yeah, my comment is be careful not to use your characters all with the same, starting with the same letter.
Right.
In a book, because you'll confuse your reader.
That is good advice, although sometimes it works out that you might have a few with the same,
Yeah.
Same there,
they're
but
all
it's-
the same.
then you can always vary, you can always make one name real long and one name real short. You can do quite a bit to
That would
vary
make your
that.
book unique. The critics would probably love it, every character started the same with.
Anybody else?
Is that kinda like every restaurant is Taco Bell
Yeah.
in the future?
Yeah.
I saw that.
Demolition Man, yeah. But I had one that I don't know where it came
was
from,
dumber for watching it.
but it was a character that looked like a heavy metal Metallica, Guns N' Roses type guy, that was kind of crazy, that came into my detective's office one time, and his name was Metal Clatter, and I don't know where I came up with that. Probably all the metal that was, pierced ears, nose ring,
Well, that's almost like the way I named the characters in the, Unseen Visitors.
Yeah,
For most of them, I tried to, their name is what their job is, basically, or something about them, like, well, there's one character, Red Shirt.
well, and then
And so far, I haven't killed her off yet, so.
Well, I had this guy get renamed. One of the other main characters is the alien named Archibald Wren.
Yeah.
And all of his friends have bird names, okay? And so he went to rescue Metal Clatter and renamed him Jonathan Fowler. After, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. So that's kind of how my brain works, which is kind of weird, I know.
I knew that.
Yeah, I know you do. You should talk about your characters in
No way.
the.
Okay, so that's all I've got, so if somebody else has got something, we can.
Thank you, Dave. All right, everybody stay put just for a minute. I'm gonna pass out these, I wanna make sure everybody gets one. And then we're gonna take a break. Look at you.
You forgot?
No, I didn't forget.
Okay.
I just don't want anybody moving until I get done.
Study those.
That way I don't give two people, skip one person or give
Yeah, I know,
one
yeah, I
person two.
know.
You don't
Make
need.
those announcements.
There you go. Okay. Okay, I'm done passing out.
Just for instance, Spokane
Let's take a break and, first, real quick, has everybody voted that wants to vote for officers? Okay, see Dave back there, grab a ballot, fill it out. Does anybody, wish to, be secretary for the next year? It's just a matter of taking minutes, from the meeting, and that's all the responsibility you have. We still need a secretary. So if you want to be a secretary for the next year, tell Dave, and you won't get on the ballot, but you'll get elected.